Welcome back to part 2 of session 5. So we're going to talk about molecular machines. In our last session, we talked about the cell, and in the cell you have the information-bearing DNA molecule, the RNA, mRNA, which copies, pastes, and executes the order to produce the combination of amino acids, which build proteins, which builds life. Well, before we move out of the cell, I want to talk a little bit about molecular machines, because the DNA is one miracle, but a second is the incredible nanotechnology that exists in every cell. So DNA contains the digital code, but the digital code, uh, which is the instructions or recipe for life, um, it is carried by the RNA, as I mentioned, and then the RNA, of course, executes the order to have these molecular machines build the proteins within the cell. And so this digital information given to these nanomachines is, again, beyond comprehension, really. It's an advanced form of nanotechnology within the cell, molecular machines, that reflects and outstrips our current technical ability with digital technology, as advanced as it appears to be. And as I mentioned, this kind of DNA, RNA, nanotechnology exists in the simplest one-cell organism. So I want to introduce you to another ID proponent, Dr. Michael Behe. So this is Michael Behe. He has a PhD in biochemistry, and he has a definition here of molecular machine: an assemblage of parts that transmit forces, motion, or energy into carrying out complex physical, chemical processes within the cell. Yeah, so these machines are the factory of the cell, as it were. And here are a couple of books by him. His groundbreaking book, Darwin's Black Box and Darwin Devolves. Just about the meaning of the idea of the black box here. He is a molecular or a biochemist, so he specializes in this kind of thing. And Darwin's black box refers to the fact that Darwin knew little to nothing about the dazzling complexity of the cell. He thought that cells were mini blobs of protoplasm, like jello. And so their understanding was very limited. But with the advance in science, Darwin's black box has been opened, and it's anything but blobs of jello, as we've seen. We've seen that molecular biology has been revealed. And so Behe, in a similar fashion to Stephen Meyer, says, could a random blind mutation mechanism produce engineering marvels, such as the molecular machines that we find within the cells? Is this kind of nanotechnology accidental? Not at all. And in fact, to illustrate that, I'm going to just listen to what he has to say in a couple of videos that I think will open your understanding even a little bit more. Oh, I think I might have done something wrong here. I need to just check these for sound. Okay. I'm glad I remembered. Otherwise, there would have been no audio.
Machines. They enable us to be creative and produce spectacular structures. We also find magnificent structures in nature, and each of these living structures was also built by machines. Machines that are far more elaborate than anything that humans have ever built. In fact, this log is currently being decomposed by tiny fungi that are vastly more complex than this drone. I'm Mike Behe. Welcome to the unseen world of organic micro-machines. Every living thing in the world is made of cells. Microbes are single-celled organisms. Advanced life forms have trillions of cells. Inside a cell is a bustling operation of interconnected molecular machinery so sophisticated it would put any modern high-tech factory to shame. This intricate machinery is what gives the cell its remarkable abilities. to process energy, execute genetic instructions, and replicate, all with unbelievable efficiency. I'm a biochemist, a scientist who studies the molecules of life. There's never been a more exciting time to be a life scientist. This is a golden age of discovery in molecular biology. Stunning breakthroughs in our understanding of the most fundamental unit of life, the cell, have been coming faster and faster. My own view of the cell took a turn years ago. I was in a lab at the National Institutes of Health doing postdoctoral research. I was discussing the origin of life with a fellow postdoc. As she and I thought about the cell, we wondered, how could its complex membrane, proteins, metabolism, genetic code, how could all that have formed by the accumulation of undirected changes? So we were both sort of stunned by the notion, but then we just laughed it off. We figured that even if we didn't know the answer, somebody must know. Well, in the 10 years after that, I didn't come across any science publications that adequately answered the nagging question, exactly how did the cell get to be so complex? Everything I read presumed that those biological mysteries would eventually be solved by Darwin's theory of evolution. Being an evolutionist myself, that was fine with me. Then I came across a book titled Evolution, a Theory in Crisis by a geneticist, Michael Denton. It addressed profound problems with Darwin's theory. It asked hard questions about the origins of life. And it showed that science didn't have the answers. No matter that everyone assumed it did, or assumed that it would eventually, or something. I was flabbergasted by the book. I began to look at biology with a fresh set of eyes. And I started asking questions. Lots of questions. That's what this series is about, asking questions. Not about the why or when, but about the how of biological origins. As I said, there's never been a more exciting and fun time to be a biologist. So I'm really looking forward to jumping into this series, and I hope you'll join me.
So there you have it. I think it's pretty interesting. A really, really good introduction to Michael Behe and to some of the things which he does. Oh, let me just get this paused. Get back here. We've seen these marvels of organic technology, and I want to just share with you another one. I think this one is really, really incredible. The title of this next video is Untangler of DNA Knots. Do you know that DNA gets knotted? Well, apparently so. I know that every time I go to do a Zoom a Zoom lesson with you, I go to my bag and I've got all my cables which I just have thrown in from last time, and invariably it just seems to be a law. The law of entropy, that things which are organized will always become disorganized, right? Cables which shouldn't be twisted are tangled, and I have to sort through them. And I tell myself, don't do that next time. Put them in neatly, and everything can be much easier, which I don't do. So sure enough, when I be prepared to do today's session, I went and I had to do a little untangling. Well, apparently DNA gets tangled. Go figure. And so this next video describes this incredible technology within the cell, which guarantees our survival. And so, without any further delay, let's have a look at this one. Just let me get it racked here a little again.
Wouldn't it be amazing if there were a device that untangled knots automatically? Inside your body, there is. It's called a topoisomerase. It untangles knots in our DNA in an incredible process that keeps us all alive. DNA carries assembly instructions required for your body to generate new cells. But for DNA to do its work, it must be copied in a process known as replication. During replication, the DNA strands are separated, and protein machines use each strand to make a copy of the opposite strand. The end result is 2 copies of the original DNA. However, DNA replication faces a life or death challenge before it can complete its mission. Separating the DNA strands causes twisting in the portion of DNA that has not yet been separated. Eventually, the tension from the twisting increases so much that the uncopied segment of DNA wraps around itself in what are referred to as supercoils. If nothing intervenes, this buildup of supercoils will completely shut down the DNA replication process, since the 2 strands can no longer be separated and your cells will die. Enter special proteins called topoisomerases to the rescue. Topoisomerases are amazing molecular machines that untangle knots. They come in 2 main types. Type 2 typically has 3 main sections: an upper gate, a middle gate, and a lower gate. Each gate can open or close during the protein's operation. A type 2 topoisomerase untangles DNA in 4 main steps. First, after 2 DNA segments enter through the top gate, it uses the middle gate to break one segment of DNA apart. Next, it passes the other DNA segment through this break. Then occurs the crucial step. The topoisomerase recombines the first DNA segment. The result is the elimination of 2 supercoils. Finally, now that the 2 DNA segments have been untangled, they are released by the topoisomerase. The second strand is released out the bottom and the first strand is released out the top. Of course, this is just a simple summary. The actual process is a lot more complicated. Get ready for a more detailed version of how this process may take place based upon the latest research. When we zoom in on the upper part of the topoisomerase, one of the 2 overlapping DNA segments enters the upper gate. It then binds to the middle gate. Now the second DNA segment enters the upper gate. The DNA in the middle gate is cut in 2 by the topoisomerase. 2 ATP molecules attach to the upper gate and the gate closes. One of the ATP molecules is broken apart into ADP and phosphate, releasing energy that may help keep the upper gate together during the next steps. The middle gate now opens and pulls the 2 halves of the broken DNA apart, creating a gap. Since the middle gate is connected to the broken ends, the DNA remains attached to it. The second DNA segment now moves through this gap. The middle gate closes and the attached DNA ends are reconnected. The upper gate rotates, which may prevent the second segment from moving back through the break. The remaining ATP molecule breaks apart, and the lower gate opens, allowing the second DNA segment to leave. Then the lower gate closes, the upper gate opens, and the first segment of DNA is finally released. The topoisomerase is now reset, ready to perform the same process all over again. The topoisomerase molecular machine is a wonder of the biological world. Its operation is highly orchestrated, displaying exquisite and intelligent design.
Yeah, exquisite and intelligent design, which really brings us to the conclusion of our study, where we're looking at what is the most plausible explanation, source of genetic material, the marvel of coded genetic information. And I think perhaps the way to introduce this is to perhaps put up a quote by Stephen Meyer, because this kind of sums up really what intelligent design, the central thesis. of this approach. And here it is. Meyer says, our uniform experience affirms that specified information, and we could say information in DNA molecules, the information that's borne by messenger RNA, the information that is translated into proteins in these molecular machines that we've looked at, all of those things are driven by information. He begins by talking about information even in hieroglyphics. He says information in hieroglyphics, information written in a book. Remember my doctoral dissertation? Encoded in a radio signal. Now, why would he say encoded in a radio signal? Well, SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which is ongoing, is based on the concept that alien life forms would try to communicate with us through probably something like a radio wave. Okay, interesting. We assume that it's going to be intelligent. Okay, or produced in a simulation experiment, always arises from an intelligent source, from a mind, and not a strictly material process. Indeed, whenever we find specified information and we know that the causal story of how then, and we know the causal story of that, how that information arose, we always find that it arose from an intelligent source. That is a central plank of this particular approach. You cannot separate intelligent design from intelligent life. And that brings us to our final point, looking ahead to the beginning. Of course, this is a play on words. You know, when you look ahead, you don't normally go to the beginning, you go to the end. But in here, we're talking about looking ahead to advance, to go further. We look ahead paradoxically by going back to Genesis. Now, I'm not saying that we look to Genesis for nanotechnology, or we don't look to Genesis to understand DNA. Not at all. The scriptures is not a science textbook. It's not at all. It's not so much concerned with the how it happened, but the who and the why it happened. And so when we look back, we go to the book of Genesis, we're going to the book of Origins. And a lot of people have criticized Christians as running to the Bible, as being signals of them being, I don't know, idiots, anti-intellectual, hopelessly out of touch, and so on and so forth. And there's a good comeback that I've really enjoyed. I'm going to share this with you. You recognize the name Richard Dawkins, the strident atheist. He prides himself as being the world's most famous atheist. He said this in a mocking, critical poke at theists, Christians in particular. He says, Christianity is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark. Christianity is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark. Well, one of his equals, Dr. John Lennox, a wonderful Christian apologist, mathematician from Oxford University as well, turns it and says, atheism is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the light. I like that. People who are afraid of the light. Genesis gives us a lot of light. And that's why we're not afraid of it, because rightly interpreted, it will not be an ultimate contradiction to truths and facts of science. And so we're left with this thing. Do you want to go ahead with the abiogenesis story, the belief, the faith position, the presupposition that life comes from non-life? Or is a better answer theobiogenesis? That's the term we introduced last week. God is the source of the information of the cell. God's the source of the universe, God the source of all things within the universe. Well, I reject the atheistic naturalistic ABCD assumption. I call it the ABCD assumption. Presupposition. Anything or anybody but a creator God. ABCD. Anything or anybody but a creator God. We reject that. I've been following ID quite closely for probably about 10 years, maybe 15 years. And I think it's got an appealing approach and emphasis. I like it because it makes more room for God than perhaps a strictly theistic evolutionary perspective. Theistic evolutionary perspective would be, yeah, we know there's a creator, and perhaps he, created the first cell, but from then on, blind, somewhat, I don't know how to explain how it can be purposeless, but some evolutionary process without the direct intervention of God has produced all life that is. I don't know how they square that with God's providential uh, work as creator. Nevertheless, I like the fact that ID insists that at key junctures in this journey of life, in this evolution of life, you have the infusion, insertion of divine intelligence, which makes things a little bit more understandable, and I think a lot more consistent with the science of the cell. So there's more room for God in this approach. I like that, and furthermore, it seems to be really in tune and in touch with recent discoveries in microbiology and so forth, DNA and information technology as well. And I like that. In fact, it occurred to me that perhaps ID, which is only a few generations, maybe a generation or two old now, it's in its infancy, right? But it's continuing. It's continuing to gather a following, and I think that at the stage we find ID right now is akin or similar to where fine tuning was 50 years ago. It took almost a century for all of the data for fine tuning to come in and the conclusion to be reached that it's undeniable that the universe shows marks of being finely tuned by some sort of intelligence. Now you can, as we mentioned in our prior lecture, you can opt for the get out of jail free card of the multiverse, or aliens created the universe or something like that, or you can say that as we mentioned, the directed panspermia, that God didn't create the first cell on Earth, but maybe ancient aliens seeded the universe with life and everything. I mean, you could go that way, but that's science fiction, which is a bridge too far. So I like ID because it seems to be really taking into consider the advances. And I think that the state of this movement is where fine tuning was about 50 years ago. And so probably our grandchildren will be living in a world in which there will be perhaps some kind of scientific consensus that biological life shows the marks of fine tuning the result of designing intelligence. Um, God will not be permitted, of course. You know that. It'll be space aliens who we ought to worship and continue to search for, because God is automatically ruled out. But I think that you'll be really going against the grain of science if you continue to hold on to a blind, purposeless, blind, as I say, undirected, unintelligent process of atheistic, Darwinistic philosophy and science. So we look ahead by looking back to Genesis. To advance our understanding, we need to hold in one hand the book of scripture, but also embrace the book of science, because those two books ultimately, I think, will be in concordance once all the facts are known. Let's go back to Genesis just for a little bit here, and then make a few comments before wrapping things up. So here's Genesis 1. So we had this document available last week, and you remember that we had marked in red those portions which talk about the fact that God, as the creator of the universe, spoke, and that divine word had within it inherent power to create ex nihilo, out of nothing, something which didn't previously exist. It is the universe out of nothing. God said, let there be light. So you can see in verse 4 and 6 and 9 and so on and so forth, we have creation, the formation of the earth. And then we're adding some blue here now. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation. And you'll notice that we're not going to Genesis and trying to predicate a theory of origin of life and evolution of life based on Genesis. We recognize the Genesis is not a genetics textbook. It's not a book of astrophysics. It is a theological document, and its purposes are not to describe the how so much as the who and the why. But it says God said, God was intimately involved in this process. He said, let the land produce. And you notice it's kind of passive, just let it happen. It doesn't mean that God watched it happen in an active, but it's almost as if he directs it and it creates the potentiality that is then actualized. Okay, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, trees on the land which bear fruit and seed in it, according to their various kinds. And we're going to find that the word kinds, that phrase, according to their kinds or various kinds, repeats all through these verses, because it seems to be saying here that there is in the methodology, in the way that God did the creating, this setting in place information that allows for the progression of different species. Now, we're not saying that when the Bible uses the word species, we're not saying that the word kinds here means species. We're not making that general uh, assertion, not at all. But we're saying that it seems that the word kinds here indicates a certain major group of biological um, kinds, like animals and plants, for example. Okay, kinds of living things, and it was so. Now, when it says it was so, it doesn't mean it happened immediately. We shouldn't think that it happened magically, in the space of 24 hours, as the creationists insist that God created the earth and the world and life in 7 solar days of 24 hours. I think we can safely discount that as being very anti-science and not in touch with the times whatsoever. So I don't think we should think that it happened instantaneous. Like, for example, if God said, let there be elephants, I don't think that the elephant would appear in the room instantaneously. Perhaps God used an evolutionary process of some sort. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that detracts from God's creativity, from God's design, from God's intellect, from God's glory and majesty. I don't think it depreciates God or devalues God whatsoever. I don't see it that way. Just think God's free to do what he wants to do in the way that he chooses to do it, including how he wants life to come about on earth. And it says, in the land produce vegetation, bearing, in verse 12 now, plants bearing seed according to kinds and so on. And God saw that it was good. And again, we're going to see after their kind, and then we're going to see it was good. After their kind, it was good. And so it creates this rhythm of God does something, he speaks something, he initiates something, and then he observes and says, I like what I see. Okay, verse 14, and God said, let there be lights. Well, we've looked at that. Let's go on, verse 20 now. Oh yeah, here's some more blue. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing. So we have the fish of the sea and the birds of the air according to its kind again. And God said that it was good. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase. And so we see that in the very written into the structure, the warp and woof of this passage, we see that God observes, God blesses, and God pronounces a verdict on what he sees. He says it's good. And he commands it to grow and to flourish and fill the earth. And God said, let the land produce living creatures, livestock creatures. We're in verse 24 now. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to kinds, and it was so, and it was so, and it was so, and God saw that it was good. And then we reach the apex of creation, where finally we arrive at the fashioning of the man and the woman. God said, let us make mankind in our image. And as you well know, this is not said of the created order other than of man. It seems that there's a special creation or special a creative act in which God designates a particular form of hominid as in his image. And he actually defines their role so that they may care or rule or govern or tend, manage, and so forth, the animals of creation. And 27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, and male and female, he created them. And then in verse 31, as you well know, God saw all that he had made. Now, again, if God is not limited to the space-time continuum like we are, the text can say God saw as if it were completed, although it might have just begun. But God saw it in its totality, and we could paraphrase to say God saw what would be the ultimate result of this unfolding evolutionary process. I don't know. He saw, or he could behold. He could see the end from the beginning. He saw that what he had made. And then it says it was good. No, it said it was very good. So there's an accent here. Very good. It wasn't just acceptable. It just didn't get a passing grade. It was judged by him, evaluated by him as exceptional. Very good. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? I've got a couple of quotations here. One is from Doug Gruthis in his book Christian Apologetics, where he talks about this um, species and kind. He says Genesis presents God investing in and directing the natural order, not merely letting it evolve on its own according to principles that can be explained without appeal to a designing intelligence. I like that. To me, that nicely articulates where we're going with this, is that we do not want to rule God out of his creation. We don't want a Christian God who's more like a deist God who creates and then wanders off somewhere else, you know? No, God's intimately involved. He's immanent. He's transcendent above his creation, but he's also immanent in his creation, caring for it, providing for it. And I think that states it very nice. Not merely letting it evolve on its own according to the principles that can be explained without appeal to designing intelligence. God creates according to each animal's kind, indicating a God-generated difference. I like that phrase as well. A God-generated difference in nature or essence between discrete forms of life. So we see here this possibility that at certain junctures, perhaps in the evolutionary process, that God infuses, or not infuses, what would the word, God inserts into the biosphere new information that is directed, that is governed, that is the source, that its source is in the intelligent mind of God. And then from a Genesis commentary by Arnold. So this is a theological observation. Good is the evaluation that is precisely what God had in mind. Yeah. I think he's getting at, like, if an engineer sits down at a drafting table and designs something and looks at it, go, yeah, I like it, good. I think that's the idea. God, with forethought and with volition and with will, chose to create, and he designed it. And then when he saw what he had designed, he said, I like it. It's what I had in mind. It is just what God ordered, he continued, no more, no less than perfection, and completely satisfying to God in every respect. The often repeated comparison to God as an artisan is appropriate. I like that too. Again, I mean, you see the beauty and wonder of creation, and you think that whoever designed this is an artisan. After completing his work, God inspects it and finds it pleasing. And the cosmos fulfills its purpose for creation, and all features function just as God intended. That's from his commentary on Genesis. I think that's quite good. So one thing, I just want to make a comment that when it says that God said it was good, he pronounced it good, very good. It does not mean morally good, although it was morally good. He's not pronouncing it's morally good in the sense that it had been anything but good. He's not saying that it's been remade or it's been redeemed or recovered from being evil and now it's good. It hasn't been saved or redeemed. It is good in the sense that it corresponds perfectly with his divine design. Of course, at this point, evil hasn't entered the cosmos. Evil, well, I should say cosmos, I don't know about that, but at least it hasn't entered Earth. Genesis 3 talks about that. But at this point, God says it's good. It's very, very good. Not morally good, but rather it again, as I've expressed it, that planet Earth is going to bring forth what God had envisioned just according to his plan. And so we conclude by saying that planet Earth is infused with the glorious creative power of God. So let's just wrap up here. I have one more thing to share from you. I think that you will enjoy this. Um, this is something from a couple of scientists. One is oops, what's going on here? Okay. All right, let's try this again. Okay, here it is here. You know the name N.T. Wright. This is Dr. N.T. Wright here. Uh, World-renowned, famed biblical scholar, Anglican bishop, pastor, author of over 70 books. We used his Revelation commentary, and we've been using him a little bit in our Jesus Christ Superstar study of Colossians chapter 1, 15 to 20. Well, Tom Wright is a theological genius, but he's extraordinarily humble. And isn't that interesting that the more people know, it seems the humbler that they get. And so he's one of the humble geniuses. And then down below, we've got Dr. Francis Collins, who is a medical doctor first, and then a PhD, an eminent American medical doctor geneticist. So this guy is the very top of the heap. He led the Human Genome Project. Over a period of, I think it was about 13 years or 10 years, they mapped the entire human genome. They decoded the encoded DNA, and it's amazing. He led that international effort. He's a former director of the National Institutes of Health until December of last year, serving under 3 presidents and for over 13 years. He is the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States of America. And he wrote a book in 2006 called The Language of God. A scientist presents evidence for belief, where he, as a Bible-believing Christian, talked about the wedding of faith and science. So you have these two geniuses, okay? You have these two geniuses, and you notice the title of this document is Two Humble Geniuses Sing Genesis. Wait a minute, these are scientists and theologians. Do those guys sing? Well, as it turns out, in a manner of speaking, this is not high quality music by any stretch of the imagination, but it's got a certain quality that can't be reproduced by professional musicians in the sense that it's written from the heart and sung from the heart. And that's why I subtitled this Science and Scripture in Harmony. So you're going to hear a song called Genesis. And let's see, I think that it would be a good idea if we actually look at the words. I forgot to do that. So let's just bring this back up. Yeah, here it is. So I want you to read through the lyrics with me first, so that when you listen to the song, it'll mean a little bit more to you. It goes like this: Genesis, earth and heaven in a cosmic kiss. Evolution must have been like this. Oh, I believe in Genesis. DNA shaping creatures from the dust and clay. Double helix in the Milky Way. Oh, Genesis meant DNA. Oh, how he made it all 14 billion years ago. Grace, wisdom, grace, and love. For he spoke, and it was so. Genesis, even Adam in a world of bliss, in the paradise we all now miss. Oh, I believe in Genesis. In a thrice, English expression meaning in a short time, in a moment's time, didn't listen to divine advice. Einstein wondered whether God played dice. Well, this is a rather enigmatic reference, isn't it? An allusion to Einstein. Well, I looked it up, and here's what this explanatory note means. Creation governed by mere random events. Einstein said, no, I don't think God plays dice. We're trapped within a world of vice. Why Adam and Eve had to fall, I don't know. It doesn't say. They did something wrong, and we long for God's new day. Genesis, royal priesthood in a holy bliss. New Jerusalem will be like this. Oh, I believe in Genesis. So let's listen to the song, and we'll come back.
Genesis. Earth and heaven in a cosmic kiss. Evolution must have been like this, so I believe in Genesis.
DNA, shaping creatures from the dust and clay. Double helix in the Milky Way. Oh, Genesis meant DNA. How he made it all 14 billion years ago. Wisdom, grace, and love, for he spoke, and it was so. Genesis. Even Adam in a world of bliss, in the paradise we all now miss. So I believe in Genesis. In a trice, didn't listen to divine advice. Einstein wondered whether God played dice. We're trapped within able advice. Why they had to fall, I don't know. It doesn't say. They did something wrong, and we long for God's new day. Genesis. Well, we stood in a holy place. New Jerusalem will be like this. Oh, I believe in Genesis.
Yeah, I came across that clip, and it really touched me. Not because the music's great, obviously, it's because the message is great and the gesture is great. Science and scripture in harmony, and God is great. That's the bottom line. God in his greatness, the giver of life, the inventor of life, the creator, redeemer, sovereign Lord, our savior. So thank you for joining me. Hope that this has been helpful to you. Take care. See you again.